Welcome, my friends. I am so glad that you are here. I'm, of course, your host, Jared Bowman. This is Biblically Speaking, and I have been wanting to hang out with you all week because I have got something special for you. This is day 2 of re-edits and reshoots. This video is late because I wanted it to be the best that it could be, because I know if you have a kingdom agenda, if personal evangelism is written on your heart, these are things that have kept you up at night. But worry no more, my friends, because I am here, you are here, and so is the word of God. We are going to laugh today. We are going to draw closer together as a community, and we are going to answer once and for all why creation is rational and atheism is just hocus pocus. And we're going to do it right now. I want you to imagine that you and I are not sitting across YouTube from one another, but we've actually gone out for lunch, that we're having a couple of burgers, there's a milkshake and a Coca-Cola at the table, and you and I are talking about personal evangelism in the 21st century. We're talking about how difficult it is because of the politically charged climate that we live in. We're talking about discipling our young people and how they seem to be delaying that decision to put on Christ till later and later in life, and how some of them are not really doing that at all. And that naturally steers our conversation into the thing that's really keeping us up, and that is the change that we see in the ideas of atheism. Because you see, atheism's on the rise in our culture, it's on the rise globally. More and more people are identifying as having no faith and not interested in faith than ever before. There has been a rise in this almost anti-religious sentiment in this country. And because I am an evangelist and a preacher, and you are someone who's interested in kingdom work, you want to know, Jared, what are your thoughts on this? And my personal thought on this that I want to start with is the reason why we are seeing this shift in atheism, the reason why we are seeing more of this anti-religious is not because people have come to a truer form of disbelief in God. It is because they are resisting a belief in God, because it is itself a religion, it is a faith, and it is something that they are clinging to, because when this is challenged with the notion that there is a living God, it upsets them. And I'm going to prove it to you in 3 ways, and we're going to feel a whole lot better about this when we get done. Now, the first thing I want to reinforce is that there is a difference between classical atheism, which is just the belief that there isn't a God, which doesn't try to export itself, it doesn't try to proselytize, and this anti-religious sentiment, which has more in keeping with a classical faith when it gets right down to it. And you can really see it in the level of anger of the people who express this faith. Now, we've all been in these positions where we've had religious discussions with people, and as we've matured in the faith and we keep hearing these same kinds of arguments come back to us, we find that those arguments affect us less and less, and we became more apt to teach and show people what the faith of the Bible actually looks like. Well, what we're seeing in many of these anti-religious sentiments, the reason why the people who hold them become so easily triggered, so easily angered over any idea of a faith or a religion that's presented to them or out in the cultural square, is not because they find religion repugnant. It's because they have not grown in the faith that they're holding well enough to defend it. And one of the places that we see this is when they try to defend this as the only true choice. You hear them go back to this mantra of the science will speak, because that's where they find their holy text, if you will, is in the science. And that shouldn't surprise us. God has been telling us that that is coming since Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Now, Solomon talked about this in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. That's after the great passage of opposites of one another, talking about the cyclical nature of life. And it says, and he has put eternity in their hearts, and yet no man can know the work of God from the beginning to the end. And what we see in this is that the real struggle that is provoking anger within them is the fact that they are struggling to look at atheism as a faith unto itself, and it's not answering their questions. That's why they have to export it, and why they become so angry when we don't subscribe to that particular faith. Now, as we're sitting here eating our imaginary fries, burgers haven't come out yet, but these better be good fries, because fries make a burger joint. I want to play a game with you. I want to imagine that we suddenly discover life on Mars. Not little green men, but microbes. How do you think that microbe would be heralded in the news cycle the next day? Would it just be life discovered on Mars? Or would it gradually begin to take on the narrative that somehow this disproves God because we found life in another environment? I would submit to you it would be the latter because that's always what we see. What we ultimately see is that somehow this speaks to the fact that there is no God when it doesn't. All it says is that we found life on this planet. Just have to look at the supposed evolution of mankind. We need to invite someone over to our table for lunch. You can have some of your fries. Her name is Lucy, or Australopithecus for short. Lucy was discovered in 1974 in Upper Ethiopia. Now, she's an incomplete skeleton, but the best representation at the time of Australopithecus. And what was noticed is that it seemed to have the structure of an animal that was able to walk on its hind legs. Now, this theory was bolstered by footprints that were found not in Upper Ethiopia, but down in Tanzania, 1,500 miles away. Never mind, Lucy doesn't have any feet for us to judge whether or not those are really footprints of anything like her. Now, subsequently, other skeletons have been found, and as we found more of these Australopithecus or cussus, but as we found more of these Australopithecus skeletons, what we've begun to learn is that their wrists were turned in, just like a chimp's were, in order for them to be able to walk on their knuckles. And their finger structure was more in keeping with something that would swing from the trees as opposed to spending most of its time on the ground, like a chimpanzee. Their cranial structure is much more in keeping with a chimp than it is a human. And so what we have is an extinct animal, not a missing link at all. Here's what it would need to be for a missing link. Do we have this? Do we have any DNA from Lucy that shows she evolved from chimp to later Homo sapien? Can we observe Lucy walking around the way that we're saying that she walked around? Do we have any evidence at all that would show a present day evolution of humans evolving into another form beyond Lucy? 3 strikes and you're out. Now, the big question, and maybe this is a 4th strike, is why is it on the evolutionary chain that chimps are still around, humans are still around, but what comes between them is never there? And I don't care where you're looking at or what chain you're looking at. The species that fits between is always missing. Why is that the one that's always missing? Why don't we have that living species? It's because it's not a chain at all. They were always different animals. If you really want to understand the anger of the anti-religious community in this country, it comes down to the answer they give when you point out that their chain is incomplete. They always tell you it just works. The evidence is out there. We just have to find it. That in and of itself is a statement of faith. So they're dealing with this Ecclesiastes 3 thing. They're searching for eternity in their hearts, and they're trying to drive out any notion of faith, and yet their whole worldview is predicated upon a kind of faith. You just have to take the problem up to scale. Let me show you what I mean. Come along with me. You see, the Bowman family recently took a trip to the Oregon Zoo. This is one of our favorite places in the Pacific Northwest. We get to be outdoors, we get to learn, we get to laugh together, and I get to take some really great pictures. But one of the things you learn as you're traveling the circuit of animals is that they really want you to know where each animal fits within the natural world. And I don't mean where it lives. I mean what it eats and what eats it. Some of them, like our beautiful Nora here, are apex predators. Others are food. Or otters. But I digress. What they want you to understand is that these relationships, some of which are symbiotic, are links in a chain. And that if you disturb enough of the lower links, eventually what happens is you affect the upper links. And that would eventually include mankind. And that's a really good lesson. To be faithful and watchful over small things is a really good way of taking care of God's natural world. And we should. But here's the thing. In saying that these animals need one another, what you're really saying is that they had to be within close proximity of each other as they allegedly evolved. And if they weren't, then that species wouldn't exist. And that's the problem. To really drive that home, we need to go and meet nature's worker. And by that, I mean the humble bee. Now, the bee, Earth Science 101, needs flowering plants to survive. Flowering plants need bees, and yet each of these things is supposed to have developed along its own timetable over billions of years. But that presents a problem because the kind of plants that evolved allegedly to be in a low sunlight environment were green to trap in sunlight because the air was coated in a heavy blanket of CO2 that animals couldn't really survive in. And yet we see bees thriving. And at the same time, they must be there for these green plants to proliferate, for flowering plants to spread. So you have three legs of a stool that have to be there. You have to have the bee, you have to have the flowering plant, and you have to have the environment. If any one of those legs is missing, the stool collapses. Now, is that design or is that billions of years of slow evolution? And yet, God tells us exactly how these things arrived at the same time in Genesis 1, within just a few days of each other. One of those makes a lot of rational sense that yes, these things had to be there. The other, it just worked, is a statement of faith. Now, this sort of forces the question, who has the greater claim for being rational? Look at Romans chapter 1. Beginning in verse 16, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jews and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and the unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made, and as a result, people are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. So, what you see here is God saying, you can see me through what I've created, and yet what you see them doing is glorifying the creation rather than the creator. God said this was going to happen, and this is the futility and the lack of reason that is part of this faith of anti religion. The universe that we observe, they're teaching us that it is made through a process that we don't understand, we can't observe, we can't see it, we can claim to see the traces of it, but it's a lot like that missing link that we talked about. There's no evidence that it's really the traces of it. That they're telling us that this is how we know that what they're saying is true. Their aim is to get their indoctrination into school. You ever heard anybody say that? As we're sitting here enjoying our imaginary burgers, have you ever heard anybody say that religious people just want to indoctrinate their children? Well, absolutely, I want to indoctrinate my child. I want to teach him what's true. And that's the main reason the anti religious crowd is angry. Now, this shouldn't surprise us because this has been happening since the time of the judges. In Judges chapter 2, text says in verse 6, when Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples, who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord, and served the Baal and the Ashtoreth. So what you see is that a generation of people who should have listened to Joshua, who should have been told the stories of what God is able to do, began to take on the faith of the world around them, that they didn't have that religious tradition passed on. They weren't brought up in the teachings of God. Well, what happens if they're not brought up in the teachings of God? Something's going to fill that vacuum. All right, well, we come to the end of our meal. We're enjoying the last few drinks of our milkshake. Maybe coffee's been brought out, and I can always go for a good cup of coffee. Remember to hit that like button and go over to the Biblically Speaking store, and you can buy your own Biblically Speaking coffee mug. But we're enjoying the last few sips of our coffee. Come to the third and final reason why this anti religious atheism is a faith. You see, it wants to export its own morality. Just like we saw in Romans chapter 1, how they didn't want to be grateful to God, they didn't want to honor God, they wanted to indulge the flesh, and so they created gods for themselves. What we see is that atheism is always inherently tied to whatever the momentary moral sentiment of culture is. our culture is very much affirming of abortion. And isn't it interesting that one of the underpinnings of atheism is sort of this cognitive dissonance between what is life and what isn't? Is it that something that is clearly a life that's growing inside a woman that is a child, why is that regarded as not a life? Because it's not really science at all. It's politics hiding under the veil of science. And that's the real truth about the anti religious form of atheism that we're seeing today. It's not really about, is there a God? It's about disguising the morality of culture. That's it. That's our show. I'm going to do many more lessons. And like I said, I want you to help me shape this program. What would you like to see a show on that would help your faith? Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. And in the meantime, watch this video on building your faith. Until I see you next time, have a good day and God bless.